Welcome to Just a Metric podcast. Today we are diving into the world of DeFi, focusing on a unique project called Yamfore. Yamfore is a decentralized, non-custodial lending protocol built on Cardano, offering a novel approach to crypto-backed loans. With us today is Brandon, the founder of Yamfore, who will share insights and perspectives on this platform and its role in the broader DeFi context. So, welcome to the conversation, Brandon.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, could you break down the concept of Yamfore for us?
Yeah, sure. So Yamfore is a decentralized lending and borrowing protocol building on Cardano. For main selling point is we're offering crypto-backed loans with no margin calls, no ongoing interest repayments, and definite loan terms, and this very sort of stress-free passive loan position that people can take. Yamfore's main innovative point is the fact that the protocol is the sole lender. So any sort of capital lent to any borrowers utilizing the protocol is solely owned by the protocol itself. So Yamfore was able to do all these sort of, let's say, more favorable sort of loan terms than other sort of like traditional lending and borrowing protocols, such as an Aave or a Compound, if you will, from the Ethereum sort of standpoint. So Yamfore's main innovation is that aspect, the sole lender component. With that, Yamfore garners fees through the protocol. So when someone enters a loan position through Yamfore, there's a couple of fees and there's a couple of things you have to be accounted for. We have a fixed loan fee. So that's called a CBLP flat fee. So the CBLP token is the utility and governance token of the protocol. I'll sort of come back into that. So we have this fixed fee at the very beginning of the loan, term. That's basically in a percentage of what sort of principal amount of ADA, the USD value, underlying USD value that you're depositing in. So let's say it's a 20% fixed fee, CBLP flat fee. That's going to be $20 if you have $100 of principal in ADA worth of CBLP tokens. That's obviously sort of taken by the protocol and that's given to the CBLP Treasury. We'll go a bit more into that. So after that's occurred, the borrower's assets are locked in, they're secured, and the borrower is giving a certain payoff depending on the loan to value ratio of the protocol. In our case, with the lending parameters being launched with the protocol, that's going to be 50%.
So let's focus on the core concepts. So how is Yamfore different from other DeFi lending protocols?
Yeah, sure. So the fact is Yamfore offers these sort of very passive loan terms. So just there's no ongoing interest repayments, there's no margin calls, there's no liquidation risk, and it's an indefinite loan term. Basically, with Yamfore being the sole lender in this case, the protocol is essentially investing in ADA alongside the borrower. It's just giving a higher return at the end of the day. So essentially the protocol is willing to sort of live and die by ADA, if you will. And basically it's just sort of like a secondary investor as well. So that's one of the cool concepts in that aspect. So if the price of ADA is quite low, that's fine. The protocol is still earning money on paper because of the fact that you've got this interest rate that's still being sort of backpegged, if you will, right? So it's still sort of accumulating to your position that you earn. And eventually when ADA eventually gets to the appropriate sort of valuation, then people are incentivized to pay off their loan position because they garner to gain more value. And that's when you'll also sort of pay that sort of own debt that's been accumulating throughout the time period.
Okay. Got it. What was the thought behind like going into this route, like building such a protocol? So how did you start and what is the current status of the project?
Yeah, good question. So we've been building for almost 2 years now. We started in the very early days of Cardano DeFi. So this is when smart contracts were just released. This is the pre-Vasil hard fork. So we didn't have a lot of things like just reference inputs. We were just quite limited in that aspect. So we started in the very early days. We're pretty much at the finish line at the moment. We have our Yamfore testnet v2 coming up, which is basically Yamfore finalized, and then it goes into auditing by TX Pipes. So that's very exciting. So hopefully we are targeting a launch date before the end of the year, but with auditing, these things sort of go back and forth. It could be a bit longer, but that is sort of our timeline. So we're basically just at the very end there. The idea behind Yamfore in general was sort of my frustration with just the DeFi landscape and ecosystem when it comes to specifically lending and borrowing. I sort of found that you had to always have this sort of active position when sort of managing your liquidation rate and just your minimum collateral, keeping up with that minimum collateral ratio so you wouldn't get, liquidated. So I figured if I could just have this sort of like very passive loan position where you just didn't have to sort of worry about any of that aspect and you could just pay a very much higher upfront fee, just a premium, if you will, right? That would actually be a product or a service that people would be willing to sort of engage with. And I knew there would be a niche market for that. So Yamfore was in many ways sort of born out of my desire for that sort of product. So not necessarily going out to just build a protocol because that's quite crazy. That's quite a stupendous feat, but here we are. So, but I think it came from just basically Yamfore in many ways was a product of frustration on my end and sort of seeing a sort of gap in the market for this very specific sort of loan product, if you will.
So basically some of the great products are built by people who recognize that problem and starts finding a solution for that. So it seems like you have a similar journey of trying to find that solution for a problem that frustrates you. So let's talk about a user journey of Yamfore. So let's say you have 10,000 ADA or like 1,000 ADA. So how do you start using this protocol? How do you interact with the system?
Yeah, absolutely. So the process through utilizing Yamfore is fairly straightforward. You only require CBLP in proportionality to basically what the USD principal amount of ADA that you're depositing in. So whatever value that is, you have a fixed CBLP percentage fee. So that can be, we've decided on a percentage of 19%, but just for an example, just for easier numbers to work with, we're just going to go with 20%. So if you had, let's say, $100 of ADA and you want to sort of deposit that in the protocol, you can either sort of supplement that with a further $20, which adheres to the 20% sort of rule of CBLP tokens. So $20 worth of CBLP at that particular time period, whatever that market valuation is. Or you can sort of reallocate your $100 to be in proportionality to, the 120% rule. So just sort of keeping up with that. So once you've deposited that into the protocol, that's it. That CBLP is a one-time fee that's not given back, but you do sort of obviously keep the principal amount. You're then given a payout in the USD sort of derivative of Cardano. So we're actually launching with strict criteria of like what sort of stablecoins we'll be accepting, mainly just decentralized with on-chain assets. So these can be things like the JED or RUSD in this case. So you're given a payment of that based on a loan to value ratio. In this case, it's 50% for the parameters that we're launching with. And that's it. You have interest accumulating in the background, and you basically have to just make sure that whenever you're ready to actually close that loan position, you also have to pay off that interest. That interest is a yearly fixed fee. So it's not compounding. It's nothing of that nature. It's just basically whatever the principal amount, whatever you borrowed essentially, and just a fixed fee on that every single year. And that's compounding on an epochly basis. So for the people that aren't familiar, just 5 days. So that's pretty much it.
Okay.
When it also comes to staking rewards as well, just to be very clear, the protocol is also taking that as another sort of method of payment as well. So you do forfeit your staking rewards, and that's just a method of the protocol also. That's another revenue generation method of the protocol. Apart from that's all you really have to worry about with Yamfore. Obviously, as a borrower, you aren't really quite incentivized to actually close your loan position if the value of ADA isn't up to par. And because you're paying such a heavy premium at the start, generally speaking, you sort of want to go into it with a very long-term mindset as well. So it's not the best for people that just want to sort of arbitrage, or they need quick capital for some reason. It's kind of, there's other sort of loan products that would probably adhere better to that. But yeah, like I mentioned before, we are targeting a specific niche.
Okay. So the way I understand it, Yamfore is a decentralized non-custodial lending protocol, which has a stablecoin treasury, and people use ADA as collateral along with CBLP token, as you said, 20% of the total value, and then they deposit this, and then you earn yield from it. Is it correct?
Yield from the ADA staking rewards that are being generated by the lock of ADA. And also at the very end, when the borrower pays off the principal and interest amount as well, so that the interest is on, obviously that's another revenue mechanism for the protocol. And also that CBLP flat fee as well, which we can talk about this a bit more, which actually goes into the CBLP auction portal. And that's kind of used on the back end to actually provide more value, more value to the stablecoin treasury in the protocol.
Okay. So let's go into those concepts of like CBLP auction protocol and stablecoin treasuries, and how all of these like different parts of Yamfore protocol work together, like to break down that concept, because for a lot of people, this is a very complex concept. So just break down to this very simple level where people can easily grasp those concepts.
Yeah, for sure. So Yamfore basically, because it's the sole lender in this case, no one else is sort of providing capital to lend out to borrowers. It garners its fees from 3 different avenues. And we actually have a really nice capital flow graph on our live paper, as well as documentation as well. That's sort of just a nice overview. But essentially it's through the ADA staking rewards of any ADA collateral locked in the protocol. It's also through the interest repayments of when eventually the borrowers do decide to close off the position. And it's also finally through the CBLP flat fee, which is utilized via the auction portal as a sort of backend. So those 3 aspects basically try to keep up with demand, which we are very much confident that it's not going to be the case, which is great as well, because we do have this sort of notion of a base demand level, where essentially you want to sort of dial in the cost to actually utilizing Yamfore to that extent where the treasury is always empty. So whatever stable coins come into the treasury are immediately lent out, because the market's able and willing to accept that sort of price premium. So for example, we are starting off with a 19% CBLP flat fee, but we can obviously tune that through governance. So for example, it could be 25% that the market's willing to accept. It could be 30% the market's willing to accept. It just sort of depends on finding those numbers. Obviously, the higher the number goes, the more beneficial it is for CBLP token holders, because that is just a higher return on investment. So just as an example with that as well, return on investment for initial capital lent out. So just as an example for that, if you had a CBLP flat fee of 25% and a loan to value ratio of 50%, essentially whatever dollar is lent by the stablecoin treasury of the protocol, from day one, you're getting a 50% return on investment. The protocol is Yamfore. So that's kind of just, those are the sort of figures. So it's a very high ROI, but again, it is sort of offering a product and a feature set that we haven't really quite seen in the general sort of DeFi ecosystem. And it is sort of more niche in that regards. Obviously what I've said is still a bit sort of on the more complicated side. There is a lot of moving elements, but that graph that I talked about before really sort of showcases it in a really sort of, I think, neat way.
Oh, yeah. And as you said, stablecoin treasury is a big part of how Yamfore works. And as of now, in Cardano ecosystem, there are not too many stablecoins. There is IUSD, there is JET, but the liquidity is pretty flat as of now. So how do you see the whole situation? How do you see this through a lens of someone designing this protocol? Because it plays a huge part in your protocol. Yeah.
It does. So Yamfore basically treats stablecoins as transitory assets. So as in the sense of they're not going to be there for a very long time period if we are sort of hitting that base lending ratio, right? Where there's always ample demand for whatever supply that we can sort of garner. So essentially in the case of we plan to utilize multiple stablecoin solutions, adhering to the initial strict criteria of what we're launching with. But in the case of a depegging event, for example, which is one of the biggest concerns I sort of worry about, we actually are quite covered by the fact that there's not going to be that, if any, stablecoins in the first place. And obviously we're using oracles. So we do have a partnership with OrcFax. So that's going to be integrated. So whatever sort of depegging happens, it's going to be adjusted accordingly when sort of people are borrowing. So the borrower isn't affected. It's more the protocol side, which in either case, it's not good, but at least that's a more sort of favorable towards users of Yamfore as opposed to the protocol itself. So that's more favorable overall. If someone's going to be affected, it's better that it's the protocol itself as opposed to the end user, in my opinion. In the case of stablecoins, though, we do sort of see them as, again, just a transitory asset. We do plan to have multiple, and we don't plan to actually store many, if any, again, if we're sort of reaching that base level. So it's not something I have too much of a concern about. I do have concerns about liquidity and sort of depending how big sort of we get, like, if there's enough to sort of go around when it comes to the sort of the velocity of capital in the system, if you will. That's a bit more of an in-depth sort of discussion, but essentially I'm pretty confident. I'm also hoping for, at least in the future or near future, that Cardano as a just ecosystem will get more stablecoin solutions. Because at the moment we only have two, which we can definitely use a lot more than that. But that's generally sort of how I view sort of stablecoins in the system, as in they're definitely they're quite necessary, but at the same time, it's something that we don't keep for a very long period of time. It's a very transitory sort of asset.
Yeah. So my question was like focused on that liquidity part, because if and when Yamfore get big, if there's no enough liquidity in the coin ecosystem, that's at some point it's going to bring some friction into the way in the system works. So I also hope that like a new stablecoins will enter the scene. Like Mehen should be going live in December. So I'm looking forward to that one. So there are at least 3 or 4 solutions in the pipeline. So I hope that will solve your problem. So coming to the CBLP tokens, could you explain like what CBLP token is and why is it an integral part of the way in which this DeFi protocol works?
Yeah, absolutely. So CBLP token off the bat is Yamfore's utility and governance token. It is just the integral aspect that you need to actually take up any sort of loan position on Yamfore. It's what you pay that flat fee in, which is what we're terming the CBLP flat fee. So just from the get-go, there is utility in that aspect. It's also the governance aspect of CBLP as well. We have this notion of progressive governance, which I'll love to talk more about. But essentially, long story short, progressive governance is just it's a quicker, more straightforward way for people to participate in governance without all the necessarily third-party aspects sort of coming into fruition. So there's no sort of like third-party forums for people to vote on. There's no sort of social media posts or any of that sort of nature. It's directly through the dApp itself, and it's basically through staking CBLP in what specific sort of borrowing or / lending parameter that people are interested in. It's sort of like a tug of war battle, which is really interesting. So it's a very much a straightforward sort of way of participating in the governance of Yamfore. Just going back to CBLP though, and just the core utility, It's got three main aspects to it, as I've mentioned. So utility, as I've mentioned before, it's got the governance aspect, as I've also mentioned, and it's also got growth as well. So it is that fee token. So as Yamfore sort of is more utilized, there's more demand for it, there's more liquidity in it, and it's serving more people. You should see the demand for CBLP just sort of staying present, and there should be healthy sort of growth there over the long term as well. Now, this isn't, just to clarify as well, this isn't financial advice. It's sort of just more, people are more than happy to, people are more than able to utilize the protocol without having to be an investor of CBLP in general. And that's what I usually recommend for people in general. Just if you're interested in using Yamfore, please use it. You don't have to be you only need CBLP for the initial CBLP flat fee. And that's it.
Okay. So what is tokenomics of CBLP token?
Yeah, sure. So our tokenomics are pretty much community focused. So we have quite a lot of a large allocation towards the community. So which is really important, getting that healthy circulating supply from the get-go. So we have 50% of CBLP tokens ready for distribution through the FTO, which is the fair token offering. I could sort of go more into that. But essentially that's basically a bootstrapping mechanism for the protocol, since Yamfore is the only sole lender in this case. So that's 50% there. We have 5% for the NFBO. So that's a non-fungible bond offering. That was the initial sort of fair distribution that we got just to bootstrap governance with the protocol. So that's already been done and dusted. We also had 1% of the airdrop. That was also subsequently given to the NFBO participants as well. So that's already occurred. The NFBO and the airdrop, that's finalized. We have 19% for the team. You can see our vesting schedule. It's quite lengthy. I believe it begins in the beginning of next year. So this is well after the FTO event has occurred and all of that has been sort of settled and dusted. So that's about 19% for the team. Then we have about 20% for miscellaneous. We have half of that dedicated to actually providing liquidity, because the total truth is it's quite hard to actually incentivize liquidity provisioning in a sustainable manner unless you do it yourself. So we do actually have an allocation just there, just to make sure that we actually have this sort of base amount of liquidity where people can sort of trade from. Because otherwise, if you're just it's these sort of liquidity incentive programs and sort of farming rewards, they just sort of garner mercenary capital, which is, it's fine. There's a time and a place for that, but it's not really quite sustainable. So what we found is we've sort of allocated a nice chunk where we can just sort of provide for that as well. That also, the miscellaneous also goes into development cost and just things of that nature, like marketing as well. We've used quite substantially for that. Apart from that, I think that's it tokenomics wise. Oh, sorry. And we have 5%. We have 5% allocated for the CBLP auction portal. So the CBLP auction portal is a really interesting and integral aspect of the protocol. So basically what happens with the CBLP auction portal is it's the way for the protocol to reinvest the profits earned by the CBLP flat fee. So any CBLP tokens that have been sort of collected via the CBLP flat fee go into the CBLP Treasury, and the CBLP Treasury is vested via the CBLP auction portal to a certain extent. Obviously, it's not the entire value. So over time, CBLP is being removed from the market, and there is where that sort of growth aspect comes from. But the CBLP auction portal sort of looks to reinvest those earnings in a sustainable long-term way. So that's kind of the main job of the CBLP auction portal. It's essentially just offloading CBLP at a market discount of, we're still deciding on the figure, but somewhere between 5 to 10%. And essentially that's just giving an arbitration opportunity to people participating in that, whilst also sort of providing the surplus stablecoin reserves to the Treasury itself. And that's the CBLP auction portal in a nutshell.
Could you explain that reinvesting part a bit more? So how does that work? Yep. Like when you say reinvesting, what does it mean?
Yeah. So whenever someone takes a loan position through Yamfore, they have to pay a CBLP flat fee. That CBLP flat fee, the entirety of it, is actually then taken away and put into the CBLP Treasury. Now, obviously, that is actually value that's sort of been created on the secondary market because someone had to buy CBLP in the first place. So most DEXs, I believe, are using the constant formula, which was popularized by Uniswap. So X multiplied by K equals Y. So basically, that's what's sort of going on in that aspect. What the CBLP auction portal tends to do is it tends to take a bit of that value. And again, this vesting schedule was actually designed by the community. So that's another sort of lending parameter that can sort of be decided by the auction token holders. So they can actually decide to whether to shut that off completely or just to ramp it up. It really sort of depends, right? Because ultimately speaking, that is taking value away from the current market, but just seeking a higher return in the future. So after it's done that, after the CBLP auction portal takes a bit of that value from the CBLP Treasury, it then sort of asks arbitragers to sort of come in and gives that CBLP at a sort of fixed market discount of, let's say, 5 to 10%, again, still deciding that sort of figure, and then collects stable coins from that. And those stable coins are sent directly to the stablecoin Treasury, where it's lent off again. And then that's kind of the workflow in that regards. So it's sort of investing the earnings from the CBLP flat fee to just sort of hopefully in the future when there is, enough capital velocity, you will get if there's a high enough ROI, and then at least initial as well, it should quickly to, or maybe even medium to long term, sort of get that capital back, and then plus some. So that's kind of, that's in a nutshell.
Okay, got it. So you mentioned a bit about governance. So I was reading through your white paper or the article, and there was a term called like progressive governance. So that sounds very interesting. So now moving on to the governance part of Yamfore, could you just walk us through the governance idea behind Yamfore?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this term, we have a very different governance system that we're calling progressive governance. We're titling it that. Essentially, progressive governance aims to sort of just eliminate any sort of third-party interventions or any sort of the use of anything that isn't really quite on-chain verifiable, and just in that sort of cryptographic nature of just, immutable and just unstoppable nature. So essentially, progressive governance occurs within the dApp itself. So on the Yamfore app.yamfore, when we launch eventually to mainnet, and actually you can test this out, hopefully, because progressive governance is an incentive after the initial mainnet launch. So hopefully early Q1 of next year, not to sort of give out, too specific of a date, but eventually it's going to be home, borrow, position, market, and then vote. And the vote section is where the progressive governance will live. Essentially, progressive governance gets all the lending and borrowing parameters that we want to sort of be able to modify. It makes it available to be voted on. And essentially what's occurring is that you're staking your CBLP in either a yes or a no vote. And that yes or a no vote is usually just incrementally increasing or decreasing a specific parameter. So in the case of the CBLP flat fee, as an example, if it's set at 20%, the no vote, or the decreased vote, I should say, will be something like 19%. And the yes vote or the increased vote would be something like 21%. So it's kind of, you have this sort of incremental sort of updating nature to it. So the really cool thing about this is they aren't proposals at all. This is actually just a list of just these parameters that are just persistent in nature. So if you want to sort of increase it, you can vote in, and there's obviously a certain quorum threshold for it to actually initiate. And when that initiates, it goes into the next sort of row. So let's say, for example, there's a quorum threshold of 500 CBLP tokens for the increase or decrease, and you're at 20%, and it's incrementally updating by one integer point. So in this case, someone comes in with CBLP, they stake 100 CBLP tokens for the yes vote / increase. Someone else comes in with another 100 CBLP tokens, and they vote for a decrease. That obviously, they both cancel each other out. So you're back to zero essentially. And that's how that sort of works. Eventually, when you have enough positive votes in either direction, that's when that change occurs. And when that change occurs, it's very incremental. So in the case of, let's say it's 21%, go from now 21%, so you can either go back to 20% or you can go to 22%. What you never do with progressive governance is you never go from 20% to 25%. So because of the fact that it's so accessible, it's so sort of easy and transparent, you have these sort of guardrails of any changes occurring being very incremental in nature. So that's sort of the way that we've sort of made sure that people can actually get a proper feel for what they're actually voting for and what they're actually advocating for. So it's kind of the best example, and I think I've given this example before, is going to the gym. If you're going to sort of be on the bench press or et cetera, you don't go from 0 to 100. You work your way up progressively. So this is just the best method of sort of getting that. So people can sort of choose to, if they really want 25%, you have to form consensus 5 times over if you're starting from 20%. And that's the same thing for the interest rate. That's the same thing for the loan to value ratio and these other sort of aspects as well. It's a bit more trickier for the stablecoin, like you're selecting a stablecoin or selecting a stake pool, but the same idea sort of counts. People can actually make these proposals again within the dApp itself, and then people can sort of vote in this sort of like tug of war fashion, if you will. And you've got this sort of list of pre-existing votes. You've got this other list of, you've got this other list of existing sort of parameter, and you've got this other list of just, creating a proposal. So we're still kind of figuring out how the UI UX aspect will look like in that regards, but essentially that's kind of the whole idea for it. And it's really exciting, I think, because we just get to sort of see this very straightforward system where there doesn't have to be any interventions, and it's all completely on-chain as well. So when people are voting, there's no off-chain sort of aspect blocking. It's just on-chain. You're dealing with smart contracts from all the way from A to B to C to D, the whole entire process.
So all of those parameters are being, updated using this progressive governance aspect of the protocol. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So
And for this to work very smoothly and work as intended, you need like a very good distribution. And now I understand why you already implemented all those steps for this token to have like a really good distribution in the initial part. And I think that's going to play a huge role when,
Yeah.
especially, for this to like really work out, you need that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like just from the get-go, the team has substantially less allocation than the community just from the get-go. And if you look at the, like, even just going back to the miscellaneous aspect as well, we have given so many giveaways and et cetera. So it's just, yeah, so it's good that we can't, even from day one, when progressive governance starts, we can't override anything, but there's more sort of voting power with the community base itself. But at the same time, though, there is that sort of aspect, that guardrail aspect of just, okay, these changes are incremental. So if you vote for something that you don't really quite understand, you'll see that sort of incremental change. And you sort of, it's not too late to sort of revert back. Obviously, this can sort of take a bit longer if you're really quite sure you want to go from 20 to 25%. But it's kind of like a bit of a drawback. It's a give and take sort of situation. It's a bit of a trade-off situation, which yeah.
So there's also one other part of governance. So there will be other ideas that you'll definitely have over time. So how are you going to integrate such ideas? For that, you need kind of like this traditional like DeFi governance part. Like how are you planning to do that?
No, so Yamfore is going to be fixed with what you see is sort of what you get.
Okay.
So we can work on the Yamfore V2, but that has to be a separate that wouldn't even be called Yamfore necessarily, right? So so this way the team can essentially, if there was no other steward of Yamfore to sort of take care of things, the protocol is fully autonomous, and it's just a matter of it's just a set lending and borrowing parameters as listed in the white paper. And there is kind of no upgradability to that at all. So that's a route that we've specifically taken, where it's just, we can't, after it's launched, it's immutable, it's done.
Oh, okay.
That should be real DeFi, because because you would need a method to transfer funds through, which kind of gets hairy. And then that sort of makes almost makes everything else mute, the foundational idea of everything else, because then the community members aren't really in control, because this thing can be zapped away at any time. If you wanted to vote for 20% interest or to raise it or plug, and the team, if they really disagree that much, could just sort of come in and go, there's a V2 and now it's fixed at, whatever interest that we say it is. So, yeah.
So if there is something in the protocol you feel like, okay, it needs to be fixed, it will be an entirely different protocol.
It has to be. Yeah. So
okay.
It has to be.
Okay. Yeah. This sounds very interesting, because currently there's no such protocol in the Cardano ecosystem, in the sense that this concept of this non-upgradable, this is done, okay, this is set in stone, and there's nothing else, right? Nothing else that took this particular path.
No, I don't. I mean, from looking at the landscape in general, nothing specifically like Yamfore. You do have sort of more, I suppose, you do have loans that are sort of like more passive in regards to perhaps your there's no interest repayments, et cetera, but you still have to manage your, MCR at the end of the day. You still have that liquidation risk. But yeah. And also having that sort of approach of it really is in many ways trade-offs versus trade-offs when you look at many things, especially in the DeFi space. Because if you have this sort of idea of like having this, okay, once it's launched, it's done, it's dusted. Obviously, if there's any sort of like underlying things that you'd love to improve, or just, there is that aspect of you've launched it, it can't be sort of, it's immutable. But yeah, but from what I'm looking at, and I keep an eye out as well for like non-liquidation, no ongoing interest repayments, et cetera, those loan products. I think Yamfore it's going to be the first in the DeFi space, I think.
I'm excited to see it going live. So when is the mainnet coming?
Yeah, so we had our testnet V1 launch, which was basically just the core lending and borrowing aspects of the Yamfore. And that was pretty integral to us actually getting some really good feedback in regards to just like what needed to be buffed, or certain aspects of the protocol that weren't sort of up to par. So that was pretty handy. We have our testnet V2, which is basically Yamfore completed. And that's going to be going straight directly into auditing. And hopefully, depending again how auditing sort of goes, we are sort of aiming for that just before the end of the year launch. So yeah, we have our auditors RTX pipes, and they're already sort of in our repos. So I guess in a sense, preemptively auditing, we'll get tips here and there of like, hey, can you guys, do XYZ, or like, it's looking good, or yeah. So we have that sort of going on. But yeah, we're very close to the finish line. At the moment, if you go on the Yamfore website and you sort of click on the launch that button, you will just come to like a, coming soon page. So we've removed the link for the initial testnet V1, because that was just not really representative. And we sort of figured it's good. It was also based on a couple of previous implementation and mechanisms. So we kind of felt that would be more confusing, if anything. So we're just sort of like now is just working on finalizing testnet V2. So yeah, as per the devblog 10, that should be around the end of this month. So that's the really exciting sort of aspect, obviously barring no hiccups and et cetera. There's always something that goes awry in developing. But yeah, we're pretty excited. And it's just a matter of a couple of weeks, I think. depending how auditing goes again, and we're off to the races. This
It's
is
fantastic.
obviously this is including everything with Yamfore minus progressive governance, because progressive governance is an initiative that we plan to work on after launching on mainnet.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. So in this case, basically the token allocation of the team for the team is actually the remuneration. Is that the way you think about like the revenue part of building the protocol? Like you have sunk your time and money into something. So is
Yeah.
that the business model? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's definitely
Yeah.
the compensation aspect as well. Of course, our devs are paid with ADA, and it's just I take this viewpoint of just the equity, or I suppose the tokens from this project. That's kind of a bonus, but you should still be paid a fair wage for what you're doing right now, because the tokens are a promise, if you will, in a sense of the word. So yeah, so that's the main sort of model of compensation, I would say, for the dev team in general. And yeah, and with the advent of other sort of like more traditional lending and borrowing protocols, you can just borrow substantially from your holdings, which is really quite exciting, which is an aspect of DeFi that I really do quite enjoy, right? When you sort of have these Aave or compounds, etc.
Hmm.
And if you hypothetically, I suppose, I shouldn't say hypothetically, but in theory, of course, if you sort of over collateralize to a very conservative degree, then the aspects of liquidation, they become obviously substantially less. The risk of that is substantially less. But obviously with that comes, capital inefficiency, because you're not drawing as much value as you could. But at the same time, it's that trade-off. But yeah, but to answer your question, in short, absolutely. That's the sort of main sort of compensation method. It's just the token bucks.
Okay, great. So this is a fantastic concept, and
We're
it's going
close.
live soon. Yeah, and the mainnet would be coming soon. So like very much excited to see Yamfore live. So basically once you have deployed Yamfore, I mean there's nothing much for you to do. Basically what I understood is that once Yamfore is done, I mean the job is done. So after the mainnet, what are you up to? Because you are building a brilliant concept, but once it's done, I know that you are still excited about DeFi. So what are you going to do next?
Yeah. So hopefully after Yamfore has been launched, I can definitely see me getting into progressive governance, just having that hammered through. Then after that's completed, then that's me at least is Yamfore completed. Just because it's, in that case, we don't need to exist. Ideally, there should always be, to a certain extent, sort of an entity at the background that sort of just, whether it's even superficial things or sort of community building initiatives, or just, constantly advertising the protocol, there should be someone or something there. But yeah, after Yamfore is completed, I might look at, other sort of UTXO chains and just sort of play around that sort of aspect. Or I might even sort of, look at entering and sort of seeing what I can do in the stablecoin sort of region of Cardano, because that's a very interesting aspect for me. I'm thinking of something, combination between MakerDAO and Liquidity. I think we can sort of do something whilst sort of keeping to the principles of UTXO. And not to talk about, I know it's talking about another project, but I do have a developer on the team called Micah, brilliant guy. And he's building something called Butane, which is very interesting. So I'm looking to see what he's building in that aspect. So yeah, so that's like kind of.
What is Butane? Can you elaborate on that?
Of course.
What is Butane? Who is the builder behind it? Just talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the builder behind it is actually our backend developer, and his name is Micah Kendall. So Butane is a synthetics lending and borrowing protocol coming in Cardano, or you can just sort of say synthetics protocol in general. And Butane's main mission is to give ADA holders and people in the Cardano ecosystem exposure to assets that are off chain. So this could be this could be derivatives, or this can be like minerals, like things like gold, for example, or silver, or just other sort of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum. So it's very similar to like Indigo, with a couple of key feature improvements and a couple of differences, I think, that really sort of make it stand out. It is from day one, really sort of utilizing that UTXO model, and sort of with that in mind. So there isn't actually any sort of notion of any sort of batching, to my knowledge, at least, because this is obviously still in the iteration phase. So there's no sort of batches or sort of sequences or any of that sort of thing going on. Each position that people sort of open with Butane to sort of get exposure to these sort of synthetic assets, they're treated as a single UTXO. So yeah, which is really fantastic, which is great. So Mike is the brainchild, as the saying goes, working behind that. So I'm just excited to see anything that he sort of releases. You can collateralize your position with multiple assets, and it's looking like he's doing some really interesting things with repayments and liquidations. And just a breath of fresh air and some really cool innovation in that aspect. So that's something I'm definitely looking forward to.
Yeah, this sounds fantastic. I mean, there are some really brilliant people in Cardano building brilliant stuff. So the whole point is to bring people and bring people here and talk about it, break down these concepts. And you have done an amazing job here, like walking us through the concept of Yamfore. And I'm really looking forward to the release of Yamfore. So I wish you a lot of success, man. It's a pleasure, man. So take care.
You too. Take care. See ya.
If you watch this far, you will like more content in our platform, Just the Metrics. So please subscribe to the channel and subscribe to the newsletter. Thank you.